The first question is really on the way that style has been used in contemporary culture as a commodity form, and the way that people are in many ways integrated into the culture through the use of style. Some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah. I think from the outset that one of the things that needs to be said, precisely because the world of style sort of claims to be that that's all there is. When I tend to think about style, my impulse is to try and connect this world of image and this world of pure representation to sort of other aspects of the society in which it exists. In other words, my instinct is to assume about any society that the way in which images operate is connected to the way in which people live within that society. And I think that there's probably no way of understanding the power of sort of disembodied image and representation as part of the aesthetic system and sort of the structure of desire within contemporary culture without beginning with the question of money. And that is to say that this is a society in which at sort of its bedrock, the system of value itself, economic value, is predicated on disembodied representation. It was built into the dollar. The economic system itself, the sort of bedrock of contemporary life, the market, is predicated increasingly on this sort of idea of disembodied representation. Money, credit, stuff like that, all sort of has implicit within it the idea that what is truly of value is not the thing, but is the representation of the thing. And in the United States, for example, during the decade where more and more people were saying style is everything and sort of substance is getting lost, on the economic level, the very structure of the economy was moving from a situation in which the symbolic economy, the economy of credit and junk bonds and all of this kind of stuff, was sort of exponentially growing in importance at a time where that sort of economic base, predicated in manufacturing or in agriculture, was going down the tubes. And the result of that is not only that the sort of basic system of economic value within the society was built on representations of value, but then more and more people's jobs were involved. More and more the kind of work that people do is involved in negotiating with symbols. Whether it's working in advertising or other promotional industries, or whether it's working in banking or stocks and bonds or insurance or all of that kind of stuff. And so, in order to understand perhaps why sort of this idea of pure style is so alluring, I would begin by saying that we live within a world today where pure representation at many different levels within the society has come to be the sort of imprimatur of truth. Okay. Within the framework of a society where the play of symbols, stands at the heart of economic life, the play of symbols has come to affect more and more aspects of people's everyday lives, and I think that's really where we come to the question of style and sort of this overemphasis, or this, forget putting even a evaluative judgment, this enormous emphasis on questions of image and self-presentation and so on. There are sort of various things at play. One of the realities with which we live is that we live in a consumer society, a society where the basic measure of economic health in the market is the ability to have people using up and disposing of what they have and replacing it with something new. And one of the basic ways in which the market has built the premise of disposability into it is through the use of style. And so this kind of transformation of everything into style, up to and including life itself, people talk about the lives they live as lifestyles, is a sign of the way in which sort of the inner fabric of existence has become more and more affected by a world in which the flutter of images replacing images, has come to sort of dominate sort of economic life, the life of the market, etc. So I think that's one aspect of it, other than sort of accepting style on its own terms. I would say that the prevalence of style and the prevalence of image is to some extent rooted in the bedrock of an economy based on representational value, and is to some extent also predicated on a market which depends in fact on the constant circulation and displacement of goods with other and new goods. And one of the basic ways in which that takes place is through the process of style. It began really in the fashion industries. By the 1920s, that tendency of changing fashions, it was being applied to all different kinds of goods.
In the car industry.
The car industry was the next to pick it up, but bathroom scales and appliances and all kinds of stuff, even labelings on cans, corporate logos, and so on. The results of that, I mean, I think are sort of many-fold. One of which is that people live in an environment where, because changing style is so much a part of the way in which they situate themselves, and I think Hollywood has had a lot to do with this, where image and style have become increasingly the lens through which people understand a lot of social and historical processes. Obviously, on the most basic level, people make judgments about themselves and each other on the basis of style. There's a lot to do, particularly with living in an urban environment, where sort of interactions between strangers are very common, and where sort of the ability to make judgments on the basis of what one sees, right, is a part of surviving within that kind of an environment.
Isn't there like a positive aspect to the style, that people use style as a resource to make themselves, to invent themselves?
I think that there's no question, and it's one of the reasons why it's in stuff I talked about today in the lecture. It's too simple to kind of view the image, merely as this sort of virus which is running through the society. Imagery is historically, and I'm really prehistorically, one of the fundamental resources by which people have articulated themselves and articulated their world, and I think that continues to be true. I do think, however, that within a society where sort of style has become essentially this fundamental currency of existence, and where to a large extent people's access to style comes through the marketplace and is in certain ways tied into the sort of engines of disposability, that each one of us, in sort of employing style as a sort of voice of self-expression, also is caught sort of between that sort of desire and instinct towards self-expression and sort of self-actualization, collectively or individually. And in fact living in a world where one's sort of stylistic identity has become a very important part of being able to function in that world. When I ask my students what is the sort of primary thing that they think about in going to a job interview, the immediate thing that they start talking about is the way that they would dress. That there is a recognition, and I think this becomes accentuated in a service economy, that self-presentation is not merely just you speaking for yourself, but it's a job category. Whereas 100 years ago, sort of technical skills or mechanical skills or agricultural skills were these sort of fundamental aspects of what it meant to be a creative person or a productive person or an employable person. Today, self-presentation in a lot of areas has become one of the most basic aspects of what it means to be employable, to be a sort of viable person within sort of the social and economic marketplace. And so all I'm saying is that I think that people are very much pulled between the idea that through image they can in fact say things about themselves, even raise questions about their world on an imagistic level, and also the recognition that the kind of fixation on the play of images is not something that's totally in their control, and that to a large extent is fired by other aspects of the society, the economic structure, the system of disposability, the nature of work in a service society, and so forth.
There's another question. This has to do with image and reality. There's a lot of discussion here about the original and the copy, image and reality. As though perhaps reality in itself is unproblematic.
Absolutely.
And
see, I think that sort of image-reality split is a dead-end kind of issue. My assumption is that the images with which we are confronted and express ourselves in contemporary culture are as related to our reality as the images used by, say, the Mayan Indians in talking about the processes of the moon, or that were used in various other customary cultures to speak about, people living in agrarian societies, creating an aesthetic which in certain ways was all about fecundity and the growth of plants. People living in a fishing culture, creating an aesthetic which is all the tendency, which is all about the sea and about the sea as the source of life. And I think the tendency of a lot of moderns, and in certain ways I think a very problematic tendency of people in the contemporary world, is to assume that those people created an imagery which was embedded within a way of life, but that our imagery sort of floats nowhere, and that sort of reality and substance have become removed from one another. I would suggest that that's not the case, and that rather what has happened is that reality has changed along with the image changing. And that, just as one would find within, say, the arts of certain customary cultures, a place in which image spoke articulately about what it meant to be a person, spoke articulately about what it meant when one talked about values, spoke articulately about what it meant when one talked about the relationship between people and their material environment, about issues of social relationships and power. I think that within the imagery of contemporary life, those same issues are there. That is to say, reality is not some sort of static given found in some sort of primordial nature. Reality itself, if what we're talking about is kind of lived experience, is something which, like images, have a history. And I think from a critical vantage point and from an analytical vantage point, what we really need to do is not just to go on and on, kind of bemoaning the sort of triumph of simulacrum and sort of, bemoaning, the idea that sort of image and reality have nothing to do with each other, but in fact really confronting the ways in which imagery are a map by which we can come to know our reality more closely. And perhaps if we develop certain kinds of interpretive approaches to the world of the image, come to understand our reality more critically. In other words, when I, for example, in my teaching, or even say in the lecture today, get people to look at images closely, I'm less interested, although a first step obviously is getting people to look at and start trying to read and make sense of the image world. I'm less interested in them just becoming masters of image analysis than in having them become people who, within the realm of the imagery, can come to see manifest some of the realities and problems of contemporary life. I mean, just the way in which, if we would go back to some sort of anthropological setting, and we would look at the cups and the bowls and the designs by which people live and say, through those kinds of things, a whole way of life is being mapped out. And if we can look at those artifacts, we can understand that way of life, both its visions and its possibilities, as well as its limits and its restrictions. My sense is that the study of the world of the image in contemporary culture can yield the same possibilities, the ability to really look at the world and look at reality and understand it more intelligently.
That's actually one of the things that I really wanted for you to talk about. I think you've done it very eloquently, this split between image and reality and that kind of stuff, which is an important one. Often gets lost.
Well, the whole last section of All-Consuming Images, which is on sort of the politics of style in contemporary culture, takes these sort of fundamental areas of life, power, value, the relation between people and the material environment, and examines those questions imagistically. And I would say that the kind of embedded agenda within that section of the book is really to get people to appreciate the synchronicity that exists between the realm of image and a way of life. I think one of the real limits of sort of postmodern analysis is that it is often sort of accepted the idea of the disembodied image at face value, and that we live in a world where there is no reality anymore, that we live in a world where there is only image. And let's put it this way, if we live in a world where image is taken over, it's because reality itself has become a place in which image has taken on a particularly powerful function in everyday life. And so, you know, yeah, I mean, I'm very committed to doing what, to a large extent, people have abandoned, and that is really trying to resituate our understanding of images within the world as it is. And I basically assume that the world is comprehensible, and that the flutter of images, which often makes it, within, say, postmodern theory, seem sort of beyond analysis, almost, and that the analysis becomes that it's beyond analysis, is an example of sort of intellectual life really reneging on its responsibility to make the world more coherent, understandable.
Yeah, in many ways, it's when you talk about images, it's the same way that anthropologists talk about goods as markers and
Absolutely.
the way people relate to each other.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, I think it's not something I learned particularly through academia, but I was as a person, I grew up in a family which over a 3-generation period had moved from being immigrant people very sort of wedded to a material way of life, to becoming, in my own case, sort of a child of, you know, the American barbecue that was taking place in the post-World War II era, kind of this new consumer culture in which image was everywhere. And I think because in certain ways, in my own sort of autobiographical experience, family, grandparents, parents, you know, at different generations, I almost sort of intuitively understood that the way of life that was being proselytized in my immediate environment was very particular and was very at odds with the way in which other people had seen things. I began to have, in certain ways, a very sort of relative view of immediate culture. In other words, to understand, yes, it was a way of seeing, but at the same time it was also a way of not seeing. And I think I was, on a very instinctual level, always sort of thinking about the silences and those sort of ideas and outlooks which were buried within the sort of framework of contemporary culture or hidden. And as a result, I think what sort of drew me in the direction that I went in terms of my own sort of intellectual and, forget intellectual, in my life, was to sort of be like a Martian anthropologist, you know, somebody who had sort of landed in the middle of this world, and rather than just accepting sort of American consumer culture as quote-unquote reality, seeing it as a particular reality and as a way of seeing and a way of engaging in life, which had certain premises built into it, and which was not, in fact, the only way to live.
One other question, this is probably the last question, has to do with authority and what has happened to authority in, let's say, consumer society, and the way that the fusion of authority, the way that it sort of works itself out in the process of every day. I'm not sort of making it coherent, but can you kind of speak about the way power is deployed and authority?
Yeah, I mean, the question of power and authority is very complex, because it is not a society in which sort of someone stands above as the godhead and everybody else bows down. And although, in fact, in every advertising agency there are people who sit around tables and decide how they're going to get people to do something that they might otherwise not do, purchase this product and so on. The way authority is exercised is not purely on the level of conspiracy. I mean, to a large extent,
you often been accused of that, by the way.
well, by people who don't understand what I'm talking about. What I have done as a historian is that I have unearthed, in fact, people who were beginning to give shape and definition to a world unfolding. That is to say, there are certain moments before advertising has become what it is today, before a consumer culture has really taken flight, where there are certain individuals who imagine a way of life which has not yet come, and who are, to a certain extent, visionaries of that. But, you know, the way it really happens is that a lot of those visions and assumptions and sort of presumption, premises, which certain individuals at certain given points may see and may be very articulate about, the way they work their way through a culture is that they become routinized into the workplace. They become, I mean, it's not as if everybody in the advertising industry is consciously, trying to get people to sort of hate themselves and desire to become, inanimate objects. I think to a large extent, the sort of, submerging of the subject and the elevation of the object within society really is something that is sort of filtered through in this kind of ineluctable way that cultures operate. They're not easy to find in terms of, cultures speak to people in very mythic kinds of ways. It's not a set of rules which are being presented to people. And it's often in a very sort of unreflective way that culture is passed on. And although, as I said, in a society where there is a large sector of people who are employed as compliance professionals, whose job it is, in fact, to get people to comply to political views or to purchases or whatever, which they, I don't think it's, I think there's something quite naive about dismissing the notion that there is will and in certain cases conspiracy involved. To kind of view it as a society which is purely the result of conspiracy at the same time is nonsense. Cultures there are always conspiracies throughout history, but there is also culture. And culture, the kind of way in which ideas are communicated as a way of life, is really ultimately the most persuasive form of the transmission of a culture. I want to say something else about authority, because I think now, as sort of we stand on the threshold of the new millennium, right? And we all have lived in a society where sort of instrumental images have been used to sell everything from, soap suds to dog food to human annihilation. A lot of people have become increasingly critical of, or at very least cynical about, images. And so in certain ways, one might look at this sort of relationship between people and at least the commercial and political image world and say that to some extent, patterns of authority, which had much more legitimacy some time back, are having a harder time, convincing people of things. I think it's more interesting that in the U.S., politicians have moved off of the news onto the talk show as an environment to communicate with the consumers who make up the electorate. I think it has something to do with the fact that news doesn't have the legitimacy that it once did, whereas sort of human relations, which is the stuff of the talk shows, still resonates in a certain kind of way. I think, though, and this is perhaps the most disturbing and problematic question, that although in many ways people have become more critical and or cynical about the image and the uses of the image, and in certain ways more savvy about it, what has happened simultaneous to that is that the market has become more and more pervasive. And that we're living at a time right now where the market, beyond being all-inclusive, is also being held up as a sort of object of religious devotion. And so that while certain customs of mass-mediated authority are having problems in terms of their ability to convince, the sort of hegemony of the market is more pervasive than it's ever been, certainly in 20th century. And so we're at a moment where that market, in fact, and since the market has become increasingly a seamless image environment as far as most people see it, where the market has itself in certain ways become the locus of authority. So I don't think that the sort of cynicism about more traditional uses of imagery necessarily means that we're moving sort of beyond authority and into a kind of anti-authoritarian mode. It's disturbing to me the extent to which the market has taken hold as sort of the only imaginable way of life in many people's minds.
One more.
Go ahead.
This is just related to the stuff that you said about advertising and how advertising don't essentially use an ironic distancing approach. In other words, that they make you share in their cynicism about their products.
One of the problems
that's more effective.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems which advertising has had from the beginning, and I know this because I've studied the rise of the advertising industry historically. And if you go and you read the trade journals and the kind of reflections of people in that field, one of the things that they continually talk about is this thing called consumer resistance. That is to say, while people want things and people want a good life, simultaneous to that, people are resistant to being propagandized. And when ads are, when we live in an environment where we're surrounded by messages which are trying to get us to rethink things or to behave differently, part of the folk culture, the culture of resistance actually, that emerges within such a society, is in fact very rejecting of the official imagery and the official messages of the society. And by the way, I would add increasingly, one of the ways in which people resist is to create counter-imageries. And more the way in which we tend to understand resistance is through images of resistance more than necessarily, say, traditional ideas of political resistance or struggles over political, social, or economic power. And as a result, part of what advertising is continually doing, advertising doesn't operate in a vacuum, it operates in a social world where people are quite resistant to. Now, I'm not just talking about sort of cultural radicals, but your average everyday person tends to view advertising as an intrusion upon them. And one of the things that's emerged in recent years is a kind of advertising which one variant of which I've called desublimated advertising. I'll explain that in a moment. But advertising, because it continually faces the cynicism of consumers, has increasingly become aware that one of the ways of lowering that resistance is to in fact share the cynicism in the advertising itself, to kind of express anti-advertising attitudes, to have people selling you cars telling you that they're lying about the product that they're selling you. And therefore, rather than having this kind of irreconcilable difference, these butting of heads between sort of seller and consumer, to create a kind of, at least on the level of the ad, some sort of commonality of perspective between the way in which a company articulates itself publicly and the way in which people as consumers often relate to those companies. I use the term desublimated advertising because one of the sort of pieces of the folklore of capitalism, which is particularly strong in the U.S., is this whole question of subliminal advertising. When I run into students, one of the first things they want to talk about in terms of advertising is subliminal advertising. I know those ad people, and the word sex is embedded all through the ads, and images of you know, naked women and the ice cubes and the liquor ads and all kinds of other stuff. And they've read this book of Wilson Bryan Key, and they're all, there's this, and now the fact of the matter is that although there were certain experiments in subliminal advertising, embedding messages, and while most advertising is to some extent subliminal in the sense that beyond, that there are always levels of messages, that the folklore of subliminal advertising has always been much richer than the actual use of this technique called subliminal advertising, right? One of the most interesting developments of recent years for me, it's something I actually wrote about in an Art Forum column, is the way in which more and more ads tell you that there are subliminal messages within the ads. The first one I saw was for some shaving cream called Edge, and it was this guy with a face full of lather, and if you look closely, there were all these like sort of nubile women sort of swimming around in his lather. You couldn't see it at first. It was a white-on-white kind of design, but they were there, and clearly there to be discovered, so that in certain ways, rather than offending the viewer of the ad, it gave the viewer of the ad a sense of achievement. Aha, you know, I figured this out. It made us feel good to be able to see that. Absolute Vodka had one where in a vodka glass, very faintly in the ice, it said Absolute. You could see it, and underneath it said Absolute Subliminal in bold letters. The most widely spread one in the US, which people in Canada probably don't see, has to do with Camel cigarettes. And that is that for years, like when I was a kid, there was this sort of like folk tales running among teenage boys in particular, that if you looked at the camel on the front of the pack of Camel cigarettes, right, and you looked really close, on the foreleg of the camel, if you looked really close, you could see a man with an erection. Now, another story was that there was a woman there, nude, of course. But again, you know, circulating around the camel mascot was all this incredible sort of subcultural gossip about if you looked really close, you'd see that the reason why people bought Camel cigarettes was because there were these sexual images on the camel. Well, 2 or 3 years ago, Camel cigarettes comes out with a new mascot called Joe the Camel, whose head is a cartoon version of a phallus and testicles, and if you turn it upside down, of a vagina penetrated by a I mean, it's this most incredibly overt example of, you know, sort of a walking genital as sort of a company mascot. And I can't help but think, because I've read sort of some interview work with the artist who was very conscious that he was creating somebody whose, you know, head looked like this huge dick, right? You know, here they take this sort of subculture, which is the culture of resistance among everyday people, about what the camel people are trying to do, and all of a sudden to create a commonality of knowledge. I mean, after all, finally camels coming out of the closet, they're sharing with us the fact that their mascot is in fact a phallic symbol or is a genital symbol of some kind or another. And it's interesting because the old folklore of subliminalism was really about the kind of healthy paranoia that people felt about living in a world where they're being constantly confronted by these instrumental messages. What happens when you take Joe the Camel and you in certain ways desublimate the subliminal message within the ad is now people walk around New York wearing Joe the Camel hats and Joe the Camel sweatshirts, and so it's been very effective at breaking down the resistance. What was once, in fact, part of what I think, in fact, is a healthy resistance to the culture of advertising has now been, in certain ways, a taking on of the culture of advertising as sort of a personal symbol. It's just an interesting little historical footnote.
Yeah.